Nobody expected the fifth pianist to fail. Dr. Evander Royce had performed at royal ceremonies, sold out concert halls across Europe, and once played for 17 uninterrupted minutes after slicing his finger on a broken key. Yet tonight, beneath the enormous crystal chandeliers of Ravencourt Palace, even he stopped playing. His hands remained suspended over the grand piano. 187 guests stared at him. Evander slowly lowered his hands. "I'm sorry." A murmur swept through the ballroom. He had missed one note. One. And according to the challenge, one was enough. At the center of the room, Nikolai Serrano slowly lifted a glass of dark red wine to his lips. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He simply looked at the piano with the quiet expression that had made far more dangerous men uncomfortable. Nikolai Serrano was 38 years old, enormously wealthy, frighteningly disciplined, and surrounded by rumors nobody dared repeat in his presence. The newspapers called him an international shipping magnate. The police called him a person of interest. The city called him something simpler, the Wolf of Ravencourt. Some claimed Nikolai could end a business empire with a phone call. Others said he remembered every person who had ever betrayed him. Nobody seemed to know which stories were true. Nobody was brave enough to investigate too closely. Tonight, however, Nikolai had invited politicians, industrialists, celebrities, diplomats, and musicians into his home for a charity gala benefiting children's education. And now his entertainment had accidentally become the most fascinating event of the evening. 5 professional pianists had accepted his challenge. 5 had failed. Nikolai placed his glass on the table. "Surely," he said, "someone else wants to try." Silence. Nobody moved. Then came the tiny sound of porcelain touching silver. Clink. It came from behind him. Nikolai turned. A young maid had just placed her serving tray on a table. She was 26, with a soft, curvy figure beneath her neat black and white uniform and dark curls pinned carefully behind her head. Her name was Mireia Belrose. Most guests had walked past her all evening without noticing her face. Now, Mireia was staring directly at the piano. Nikolai followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "You?" A few guests laughed. Mireia swallowed. "Yes, sir." The laughter became louder. A woman near the front actually turned around in her chair to get a better look. Someone whispered, "Is she serious?" Another answered, "Apparently." Nikolai leaned back. Mireia could still change her mind. She could pick up the tray. She could disappear into the kitchen. Tomorrow, nobody would remember this moment. Instead, she removed her apron, folded it, placed it beside the champagne, and started walking. One step, then another. The laughter slowly faded, because there was something strange about the way she approached the piano. She wasn't walking like someone about to attempt something impossible. She was walking like someone returning to something she had been trying desperately to forget. And before we discover why a maid nobody noticed was willing to challenge 5 world-class pianists in front of the most feared man in the city. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy powerful stories about ordinary-looking people hiding extraordinary secrets. Because Mireia Belrose wasn't walking toward that piano to impress Nikolai Serrano. She was walking toward a promise she had broken 12 years earlier. That morning had begun at 5:10. Ravencourt Palace was already awake. Caterers moved through enormous kitchens. Gardeners inspected flowers. Security teams checked entrances. Chefs prepared hundreds of plates. And Mireia stood alone inside the ballroom, polishing the final row of champagne glasses. Ravencourt was less a house than a monument. Marble staircases curled beneath painted ceilings. Portraits covered hallways long enough to exhaust visitors. Italian chandeliers hung above polished floors. But Mireia's favorite thing inside the entire estate wasn't worth millions. It was the silence before everyone woke. Those few minutes belonged to nobody. She could hear herself think. That morning, however, something interrupted the silence. A piano. Mireia stopped polishing. 2 movers were carefully guiding a magnificent concert grand into the ballroom. She stared. The instrument was nearly 3 meters long, its black surface shining beneath the morning light. A silver emblem decorated its side. Mireia forgot the glass in her hand. Beautiful, isn't she? Maria jumped. The speaker was Alistair Boone, Ravencourt's 63-year-old head steward. He had worked for the Serrano family longer than Maria had been alive. Yes. You play? Maria looked away. No. Alistair studied her. That wasn't what your face said. I just like pianos. Most people who like pianos look at them. He nodded toward her right hand. You were moving your fingers. Maria immediately stopped. I should finish the glasses. Alistair smiled. Of course. He walked away. Maria waited until he disappeared, then looked at the piano again. Her heart hurt. Not metaphorically. Actually hurt. She hadn't sat at a real concert piano in 12 years. She told herself she didn't miss it. She had become very good at lying to herself. By 7 that evening, the quiet palace was gone. Luxury cars formed a line outside the gates. Guests stepped onto the marble entrance wearing gowns and suits that cost more than Maria earned in months. Camera flashes lit the courtyard. Maria joined the service staff. Her instructions were simple. Serve. Observe. Never interrupt. The last rule was especially important when Nikolai Serrano was present. At exactly 7:42, his car arrived. Nobody announced him. Nobody needed to. Conversation simply changed. Nikolai entered wearing a black tuxedo. He wasn't the largest man in the room. He wasn't the loudest. He didn't need to be. Power followed him without introduction. He greeted an ambassador, shook hands with a senator, spoke briefly to an elderly philanthropist. Then his eyes passed across the service staff. For perhaps half a second, they stopped on Maria. She lowered her gaze. Nikolai continued. Maria exhaled. She had worked at Ravencourt for 8 months. Nikolai barely knew her. She preferred it that way. Her life before Ravencourt had taught her something important. Attention could open doors. It could also destroy you. The gala began beautifully. A chamber orchestra performed. A children's charity received a major donation. A famous actress gave a speech. Then Nikolai introduced Maestro Cassiel Devon. Even Maria knew the name. Cassiel had spent 4 decades performing around the world. Critics described him as severe, brilliant, and nearly impossible to impress. He approached the grand piano. Maria stood at the back, carrying champagne. Cassiel sat. Then he played. The composition was called The Winter Crown. It had been written nearly a century earlier by an obscure composer whose surviving work was notoriously difficult. The opening sounded gentle, almost harmless. Then everything changed. The right hand accelerated. The left began leaping across enormous intervals. The melody fragmented. Cross rhythms collided. Quiet passages suddenly erupted into violent runs. Even guests who knew nothing about classical music understood one thing. This was difficult. Maria understood something else. Cassiel was playing it differently. Her eyes narrowed. Near the end of the second movement, Cassiel slowed. Maria unconsciously whispered, "Wait." The maid beside her frowned. "What?" Maria didn't answer. Cassiel paused, exactly where she knew he would, then continued. Maria's tray trembled. Impossible. When the final chord ended, the audience rose. Maria didn't. She couldn't move. Cassiel bowed. Nikolai approached him. "That," Nikolai said, "almost makes this piano worth what I paid." Laughter filled the room. Cassiel smiled. "You can't purchase what matters about a piano." "Careful, maestro. I enjoy proving people wrong." Cassiel gestured toward the instrument. "Then prove me wrong about this." Nikolai raised an eyebrow. Cassiel explained that the Winter Crown contained several passages famous for exposing weaknesses in otherwise accomplished performers. One guest laughed. "Surely somebody here can play it." Cassiel looked around. "Perhaps." Nikolai saw an opportunity for entertainment. "Then let's find out." The challenge began casually. A concert pianist volunteered. She failed. Another tried. Then another. Each mistake produced applause, laughter, and increasingly competitive energy. Nikolai eventually announced that anyone who completed the piece without a significant error could name a prize. That changed everything. One pianist asked what the limit was. Nikolai replied, "Don't be unreasonable, and neither will I." 4 attempted. 4 failed. Then Evander Royce sat down. The room expected victory. Even Cassiel appeared interested. Evander made it almost to the end. Then came one incorrect note. He stopped, and Maria put down her tray. Now she stood beside the piano. Up close, it was even more beautiful. Her hands felt cold. Cassiel watched her. "What's your name?" "Maria Belrose." Something flickered across his face. "Belrose." "Yes." He stared at her. "Have we met?" "No, sir." Cassiel's expression remained strange. "Have you studied piano?" Maria hesitated. "A long time ago." "How long?" 12 years. Laughter returned. Cassiel didn't laugh. Nikolai didn't either. "Sit," Cassiel said. Maria lowered herself onto the bench. She adjusted its position. Cassiel's eyes immediately sharpened. Professionals notice small things. How someone sat. How they positioned their feet. How they approached the keyboard. Maria hadn't touched a note, but Cassiel already knew something was wrong with her story. Nobody who merely studied a long time ago adjusted a concert bench like that. Maria placed her hands above the keys. She closed her eyes. Suddenly, she wasn't 26. She was 8. A cramped apartment. A cheap upright piano. Her mother standing in the doorway. Her older brother laughing whenever she played the wrong note. And her grandfather beside her saying, "Again." Maria opened her eyes. She played. The opening note was so gentle that several guests leaned forward. Then came another. And another. The melody emerged. Cassiel's face changed. Maria didn't look at him. Her entire world had narrowed to 88 keys. The first difficult run approached. She executed it cleanly. Then the second. Perfect. Whispers disappeared. Nikolai's untouched wine remained beside his hand. He watched Maria. Not her fingers. Her face. Something was happening to her. She looked frightened. Not of the audience. Of the music. By the third minute, Maria's breathing had changed. Memories came with every phrase. Her grandfather's metronome. Her mother's laughter. Her brother banging on the wall because she practiced too early. A tiny concert hall. A blue dress. Applause. Then rain. Hospital lights. Silence. Maria nearly stopped. Cassiel saw it. Her left hand hesitated for less than half a second. Then she continued. The first movement ended. No applause. Nobody dared interrupt. The second began. Cassiel stepped closer. Maria played a descending passage. Then came the pause. The same pause Cassiel had used earlier. But Maria held it longer. Barely longer. Cassiel inhaled sharply. His face lost color. "No!" Nikolai heard him. "What?" Cassiel ignored him. Maria continued. The maestro walked around the piano. He needed to see her hands. Then he heard another phrase. 3 notes. A hesitation. For more. Cassiel whispered. "Gideon." Maria's eyes opened. Her fingers almost stopped. She looked at him. That single distraction nearly destroyed everything. But instinct took control. She returned to the music. Nikolai stood. "Who is Gideon?" Cassiel lifted one hand. Not now. The third movement arrived. This was where 4 pianists had failed. Maria attacked it. Her fingers moved with astonishing speed. The audience collectively leaned forward. Her hands crossed. Separated. Jumped. Returned. The piano seemed too large for one person to control. Yet Maria wasn't fighting it. She was guiding it. Then something extraordinary happened. She changed the interpretation. Cassiel had performed the final movement with power. Maria played it with grief. The difference was devastating. A woman near the front began crying. Alistair stood beside the ballroom doors with both hands clasped. Celeste Arkwright, one of the socialites who had barely acknowledged Maria earlier, slowly lowered her champagne. Nikolai remained standing. He had attended hundreds of performances. None felt like this. Maria wasn't trying to prove she belonged among them. She seemed to have forgotten they existed. The notorious final passage approached. Rapid octaves. Crossing hands. Sudden leaps. The passage that had defeated Evander. Maria's fingers accelerated. 1 second. 2. 5. 10. Perfect. Cassiel's mouth fell open. Then came the final chord. Maria struck it. The sound exploded beneath the chandeliers. Then vanished. Silence. Maria's hands remained on the keys. Nobody moved. Her eyes were closed. A tear slipped down her cheek. She opened them. Nearly 200 people were staring at her. She stood abruptly. I'm sorry. Cassio looked stunned. Sorry. I shouldn't have. Who taught you? Maria froze. Cassio stepped closer. Who taught you that interpretation? My grandfather. Name. Maria looked around. She suddenly wished she had never approached the piano. Gideon Belrose. Cassio grabbed the edge of the piano. Several guests gasped. Nikolai moved closer. You know him? Cassio stared at Maria. Know him? He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Gideon Belrose was my teacher. Now Maria was speechless. Cassio continued. Not officially. Nobody ever gave him the title he deserved. He turned toward the audience. 40 years ago, Gideon Belrose worked as an accompanist at the Belmont Conservatory. Professors received the credit. Famous students received applause. Cassio looked at Maria. Gideon stayed after everyone left. Maria's eyes filled. He taught students who couldn't afford private lessons. I was one of them. Cassio's voice weakened. I hadn't heard anyone play that pause like him in 30 years. Maria whispered. He taught me never to rush silence. Cassio smiled. Exactly. He applauded. Once. Then again. Nikolai joined him. The ballroom erupted. Guests stood. Musicians cheered. Maria covered her mouth. For 12 years, she had believed Gideon Belrose had vanished from musical history. He had died without money, without awards, without recordings anyone cared about. But he hadn't disappeared. Parts of him were living inside musicians all over the world, including Cassio Devon. When the applause finally settled, Nikolai approached Maria. His expression was unreadable. You completed the challenge. Maria shook her head. I don't want anything. You entered under my rules. I only wanted to know if I still could. Nikolai looked toward the piano. Now you know. Maria nodded. Name your prize. I don't have one. Everyone wants something. Maria looked at him. For the first time since she began working at Ravencourt, she held his gaze. Then give me time to think. Nikolai almost smiled. Granted, that should have been the end of the evening. Instead, it became the beginning of the problem. By morning, videos of Maria's performance had spread everywhere. One recording received millions of views. Journalists identified her. Reporters waited outside the estate. Music schools called Ravencourt. Concert promoters wanted interviews. Cassio publicly called her one of the most naturally expressive musicians I have encountered in decades. Maria hated every second of it. She arrived for work the next morning expecting to be dismissed for creating chaos. Instead, Nikolai summoned her to his study. She entered nervously. You wanted to see me, sir? Nikolai gestured toward a chair. Maria remained standing. I'd rather stand. Why? Because I'm working. Nikolai looked at her uniform. You believe I'm going to ask you to clean something? No. Sit. She sat. Nikolai placed a folder on the desk. I investigated you. Maria stiffened. Why? Because people don't hide abilities like yours without reasons. Her expression changed. Nikolai noticed. He opened the folder. Maria Belrose started performing publicly at 7. Won regional competitions at 9, 10, 11, and 13. Maria stared at the floor. Accepted into the Belmont Junior program at 14. Please stop. Nikolai closed the folder. What happened? Silence. Maria? My mother died. His expression softened slightly. She continued. It happened the week before my biggest competition. Nikolai said nothing. She was the person who believed I would become a concert pianist. My grandfather believed it too. Maria swallowed. After she died, I tried performing again. I sat at the piano and couldn't move. So you stopped. I thought temporarily. She smiled sadly. Temporary became 12 years. And your grandfather? He died 4 years later. Nikolai looked toward the window. Why become a maid? Because life doesn't stop charging you bills because you're grieving. The answer silenced him. She stood. Is that all? No. Nikolai opened another document. The children's charity receiving funds from last night's gala is opening a music division. Maria stared at him. I want you involved. I can't teach. Why? Because playing once doesn't make me qualified. Then become qualified. She almost laughed. You make everything sound easy. No. Nikolai's expression became serious. I make things sound possible. Mireya left without accepting. 3 days later, something changed her mind. A letter arrived at Ravencourt. Not from famous orchestra. Not from a conservatory. From a 13-year-old girl named Nia. The letter said she had watched Mireya's performance on her mother's phone. Nia loved piano. Her family couldn't afford lessons. She practiced finger patterns on the kitchen table because they didn't own an instrument. The final sentence broke Mireya. If somebody like you could be hidden inside a Maid uniform, maybe something is hidden inside me too. Mireya read it twice, then a third time. That afternoon, she entered Nikolai's office. Is the offer still available? He looked up. Yes. I have conditions. Nikolai leaned back. I'm listening. The program must accept children based on potential, not money. Agreed. Free instruments for students who can't afford them. Agreed. Transportation assistance. Nikolai paused, then nodded. Agreed. And Gideon's name goes somewhere in the building. Nikolai smiled faintly. That one isn't a condition. What? Cassiel already requested the same thing. Mireya laughed. It was the first time Nikolai had heard her laugh. 6 months later, the Gideon Belrose Music Initiative opened. Mireya began formal training again. Cassiel personally mentored her. She studied teaching methods, music theory, performance psychology, and slowly, painfully, she began performing. Small audiences first, then larger ones. Nikolai attended whenever possible. Never in the front row, usually at the back. He rarely spoke afterward. He didn't need to. Mireya learned to recognize his approval from the slight nod he gave when everyone else was applauding. The biggest test came 1 year after the original gala. Ravencourt hosted the event again. This time, Mireya wasn't serving champagne. She was scheduled to perform. Before going on stage, she stood inside the service corridor wearing a simple dark blue gown. Her hand was shaking. Alistair found her. Running away? Considering it. He smiled. I remember a maid who walked through a room full of people laughing at her. She was temporarily insane. Perhaps. Mireya laughed nervously. Then she noticed a silver tray sitting nearby. The same kind she had carried the previous year. She touched it. I was safer when nobody knew me. Alistair nodded. Yes. Sometimes I miss that. Being invisible. Being unable to disappoint anyone. Alistair thought for a moment. People who never disappoint anyone usually haven't tried anything difficult. Mireya smiled. From the ballroom came applause. It was time. She walked toward the door, then stopped. Alistair. Yes. Thank you for noticing me before everyone else did. The old steward smiled. I only noticed you looking at a piano. Mireya entered the ballroom. The applause grew. Children from the Gideon Belrose Initiative filled the first 2 rows. Nia was among them. She now had her own scholarship, her own piano, and a teacher. Cassiel sat beside her. Nikolai stood near the stage. Mireya approached the piano. But before she sat, Nikolai stepped forward. Last year, he told the audience, I made a foolish challenge. People laughed. I offered a prize to anyone who could play a difficult composition without making a mistake. He looked at Mireya. I believe perfection was impressive. His voice became quieter. Since then, I've learned that courage is considerably more difficult. The room became silent. Nikolai continued. Perfection means getting every note right. He glanced toward the children. Courage means returning to the piano after 12 years of believing you never could. Mireya's eyes filled. Nikolai stepped away. She sat, but she didn't play the winter crown. Instead, she placed handwritten pages on the music stand. Cassiel recognized them. His eyes widened. Before Gideon died, he had left behind an unfinished composition. Mireya had spent months completing it. Not by guessing what her grandfather would have written, by writing the ending herself. The piece began quietly. The ballroom listened. There were no challenges tonight. No arrogant laughter. No promises of extravagant prizes. Only music. Halfway through, the melody Gideon had written ended. Mireya's began. Cassiel lowered his head. Nia held her mother's hand. Alistair smiled, and Nikolai watched from the shadows near the stage. When Mireya reached the final note, she didn't hold it perfectly. Her hand trembled. The note came slightly softer than she intended. A year earlier, she might have considered that a failure. Tonight, she smiled, because she finally understood something her grandfather had tried to teach her. Music was never supposed to prove that you were perfect. It was supposed to prove that you were alive. The final sound disappeared. For one heartbeat, the ballroom was silent. Then everyone stood. Maria looked at the children. They were applauding louder than anyone. And suddenly the woman who had spent years trying to become invisible understood why she had been given another chance to be seen. Not so the world could admire her. So someone else hiding in the shadows might see what was possible. Years later, people would still tell the story of Nikolai Serrano's impossible challenge. They remembered the famous musicians. They remembered the champagne. They remembered the wealthy guests laughing when a curvy maid removed her apron and walked toward the grand piano. But Nikolai remembered something different. He remembered the moment before Maria played. The fear in her eyes. Because courage had never been the absence of fear. It was what she did next. Maria eventually became director of the Gideon Belrose Music Initiative. Thousands of children passed through its doors. Some became professional musicians. Most didn't. Maria considered both outcomes successful. Whenever parents apologized because their children couldn't afford private instruction, she told them the same thing. Money can purchase a piano. Then she would point toward the child's heart. It cannot purchase what's happening in there. And whenever a frightened student stood backstage before their first recital, Maria would kneel beside them and repeat Gideon's favorite lesson. Don't fight the instrument. Listen first. Every year, on the anniversary of that first gala, Maria returned to Ravencourt's ballroom after everyone had gone home. She sat at the same grand piano. Sometimes Nikolai quietly listened from the doorway. Sometimes Alistair did. Sometimes she was completely alone. But Maria no longer needed an audience. She no longer needed a challenge. And she no longer needed perfection. She played because the music had survived. It had survived poverty, loss, fear, 12 years of silence. It had survived being hidden inside a woman everyone assumed was merely there to carry their champagne. And perhaps that was why the most powerful moment in Ravencourt history wasn't when a Mafia Boss challenged every celebrated pianist in his ballroom. It wasn't when 5 professionals failed. It wasn't even when Maria Belrose played the piece everyone believed she couldn't possibly know. It was the moment after the laughter stopped. When an entire room of people who had judged a woman by her uniform were forced to sit silently and discover how little they actually knew about her. Because sometimes extraordinary people don't enter a room demanding to be noticed. Sometimes they're already there, cleaning the tables, opening the doors, carrying the trays, standing quietly against the wall, waiting for one moment when courage becomes stronger than fear. And when that moment comes, the people who ignored them may discover they were standing beside greatness all along. If you enjoyed Maria's journey, subscribe to the channel because there are more powerful stories coming about people whose lives are never what they first appear to be. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment? Was it when Maria placed down her tray and accepted Nikolai's challenge? When Cassiel realized she was Gideon Belrose's granddaughter? Or when Maria finally returned a year later and finished her grandfather's composition in her own way? And if this story reminded you never to judge someone by their job, clothes, money, or position in life, like the video and share it with someone who needs that reminder today. Because the quietest person in the room may be carrying the loudest story. You simply haven't heard it yet.